It was a reign of terror that paralysed half the country with fear.
There was a horrible gloom over the north of England.
A series of murders that was so brutal that they stunned the nation.
There were stab wounds to the abdomen, but most significantly, there were 2 serious injuries to the back of the head with fractures of the skull.
For it is known that a ball-peen hammer, similar to this one, has been used in the initial attack in most of the killings.
Despite the largest and most costly police operation the country had ever seen, the killer remained on the loose.
There was this feeling that no woman was safe.
The murders committed by the Yorkshire Ripper were crimes that shook Britain.
I was really close to Mum, very close. I was more close to my mum than my dad. Family life was beautiful till a certain person come across and spoiled it all for us.
Neil's mother, Emily Jackson, was killed in Leeds on the 20th of January 1976. It was the second murder of a woman in the city in less than 3 months. At the time of her death, Emily and her husband had 3 children and ran a successful roofing business.
My mum worked in office, running the business. Me and my dad doing work as much as we can. And just have a nice holiday every year. Mum was very, very friendly. Always make pots of tea for anybody that come to the house.
By the start of 1976, few people in Leeds remembered the murder of prostitute Wilma McCann at the end of the previous October.
A milkman and his younger brother were going round with the milk float, and they saw what they thought was a bonfire night guy. But when they looked more closely, they realised it was the body of a woman. All that they could see at that stage was that she had an obvious wound to her throat.
The autopsy on Wilma McCann's body revealed the true extent of her injuries.
There were stab wounds to the abdomen, but most significantly, there were 2 serious injuries to the back of the head with fractures of the skull.
Little did the people of Yorkshire know, but her murder marked the start of a reign of terror that would stun the nation. On the evening of the 20th of January 1976, Emily and her husband were preparing to leave the house for a night out.
Mum and Dad went out for a drink and they gave me bingo, like they always did. I did babysitting. I went to bed a bit later on, gets up following morning to go to work, waiting for one of the lads to come and pick me up to go to work, and it never turned up when it was place.
What her children didn't know was that the Jackson family business was struggling, and in an effort to keep money coming in, Emily, with the approval of her husband, had turned to prostitution. That night, she wasn't playing bingo. She was looking for customers.
I always thought business was really good and money were good and this and the other, but it come out about I'm being a prostitute and it took me ages to believe it.
Emily Jackson met her customer that evening just off Roundhay Road in Leeds, the heart of the city's red light district. She climbed into his car, but after a short drive, the pair got out, seemingly because the vehicle had a fault. Emily offered to help, but as she peered into the engine, she was attacked from behind. The unconscious Jackson was dragged into an alley, where she was repeatedly stabbed.
Like McCann, she had got hammer blows to the back of the head. She had got several groups of stab wounds to her trunk. It wasn't a knife. These were wounds which were cross-shaped.
I didn't realise how many stab wounds there was till good few months after. She had 56 stab wounds, had my mum. and all over the body.
The most likely tool that we could think of that was in common use was a Phillips screwdriver with a cross head. Another weapon that we had to consider was what's called a bearing scraper, which is used in the motor trade. So the pattern's now fairly clear. Man with car, man with hammer, man with some sort of stabbing instrument, but different stabbing instrument on this latest occasion. Quite likely somebody who is in the motor or the engineering trade or has affiliations with it. By the end of January 76, I think everybody involved, the police, the forensic scientists at Wetherby, were all pretty sure that this was a series of murders and that the same person was almost certainly responsible for them.
The police were now hunting a serial killer that preyed on prostitutes who worked the streets of Yorkshire's red light districts.
By the very nature of the areas, they're generally sort of depressed and run down. People that can't really afford a high standard of housing, don't have a high standard of living, and these unfortunate women turn to prostitution to earn a living, not just for themselves, but a lot of these women have families, and that to sustain them. And the only way they could do it was by selling themselves.
In the immediate days after an attack or a murder, prostitutes that I spoke to at the time, of course, it drove them off the streets, but only very, very briefly, because, as they said to me, we've got children to feed, we've got bills to pay, and within days they would be back on the street.
Faced with a serial murderer, the police did their best to keep the public calm. The press, however, were quick to label the killer.
The phrase "the Ripper" was coined because of the similarities, and I suppose the victims, to the famous Whitechapel Ripper killings, of course. And it became fairly clear that the injuries were to the stomach, slashings of the stomach, carried out by various types of blunt instruments, like a screwdriver rather than say a sharp knife, a screwdriver, so they were pretty crude injuries. Plus, of course, there were always head injuries.
In the first 4 months of 1977, the Ripper struck twice more, first killing Leeds prostitute Irene Richardson in January, and then 2 months later, Patricia Atkinson in Bradford.
Because police fear the macabre possibility of copycat killings, they've revealed few details as to the Ripper's exact methods. However, it is known that a ball-peen hammer similar to this one has been used in the initial attack in most of the killings.
By the middle of 1977, the Ripper had killed 4 prostitutes and was suspected of attempting to kill several more. Photo fits made from descriptions of women who had been attacked were circulated in the Leeds and Bradford area. Despite this, the police investigation floundered.
You always hoped that the next door you knocked upon, you would find the suspect and the case would be solved. I don't think anybody in the early days anticipated how it would snowball into such a major inquiry. I don't think anybody could have done.
In June 1977, the Ripper would strike again, but this time his victim wasn't a prostitute. It was a killing that would change the entire investigation.
The catalyst really was the murder of Jane MacDonald. She didn't fit into the pattern because she was not a prostitute. She was very young as well, she was only 16. Prior to that point, the fear, if you like, had been exclusively felt by working prostitutes. But from Jane MacDonald on, there was this feeling that no woman was safe.
Women always went around in pairs or 2s or 3s. No woman would dare go out alone. My own sisters used to walk around with knives in the bag, in their handbags, although those were probably the safest people on the planet from the Yorkshire Ripper, but they had no idea that it was our brother Peter.
Yorkshire in the mid-1970s was in the grip of a serial killer. Initially preying on prostitutes, the Yorkshire Ripper had switched his attention to all women, and fear was paralysing the north of England.
There was a horrible gloom over the north of England, especially West Yorkshire. Some town centres actually were quite deserted on Friday and Saturday nights because I think many women feared that they could be attacked.
Jane MacDonald was a 16-year-old shop assistant from Leeds. Walking home from a night out, she was attacked from behind, hit with a hammer, and then dragged to a playground where she was brutally stabbed.
Jane MacDonald was found on a Sunday morning in June in 1977. She was assaulted at the roadside. You could tell that from the drag marks and blood splashes, and she'd been dragged onto waste ground. She had the usual serious head injury, a hammer blow to the back of the head. She had numerous stab wounds to the trunk.
She wasn't a prostitute. All women then felt at risk, and very positively it had been established that the same man was responsible for all these killings, and it had developed by this point into a reign of terror, really, right across West Yorkshire in general, and Leeds, Bradford in particular.
I think because the attacker had been so elusive and so slippery, I think a lot of women did suspect the husbands and boyfriends and did check their clothing and did check their movements and checked with their friends. And we had quite a number of anonymous calls saying, I think my husband could be the Ripper. Will you have a look at him, but don't tell him I've told you, sort of thing. There was a massive, massive movement against men as well. In fact, in Bradford, there was a march against men saying that they should keep curfews, and women-only buses started to be run.
West Yorkshire Police's response to the MacDonald murder was to bring together the separate teams investigating the killings under one roof. Based in Millgarth Police Station in the centre of Leeds, the detectives were soon deluged with information.
The problem was that it was taking police time to get through all the information because, of course, they didn't have the kind of computer facilities then that exist now.
Things that we take for granted nowadays were still all done with punch cards, postcards, statements, copper licking his pencil, writing it in his pocketbook, transferring it in by longhand to a report at the station afterwards.
I would say we were sort of still not quite in the Bronze Age with regards to paper, but that's how we worked.
Reports had to be written, typed up, then they had to be read, sifted through, and the Ripper team really became engulfed in all this material from witnesses.
So you had old information still being processed and a new murder breaking, which needed urgent attention. So, yes, the incident room staff were torn between prioritising what was relevant and what was more relevant, and it was a difficult decision to make.
Their appeals for information, you see, were extremely successful. Obviously, people were only too anxious to try and help. So there was always a time gap, a time lapse between taking the statement and them actually getting around to processing the information.
I understand there was something up to 4 tons of paperwork held at Millgarth Police Station, which caused the floors to creak and, of course, that to be reinforced. But there was no other system.
A detective once said to me, we know that the information that we need is there, but it's a case of finding it.
Buried in the mountain of paperwork that was being sifted by police officers was the name they were so desperately seeking, a killer who was hiding in plain sight. His name was Peter William Sutcliffe.
Growing up with Peter he was a really nice guy. He was, being so much older than me, he was more like a father figure, as my dad was never around. He was either working or out at the pub or doing sports events. And Peter used to teach me things that a father should, really. So he was a great big brother. We used to socialise not too often, because there was quite a big age gap between us, but occasionally I'd go out for a pint with him, and he'd take me around seedy bars in Bradford, always having his eye open for other women, which was quite bizarre, because he hadn't been married very long, and he was always trying to look out for the girls. But he never mentioned doing anything violent to them. You know, he used to say, oh, she's a bit of all right, just like most blokes, I suppose, do.
Sutcliffe's ability to stay under the police's radar was no doubt helped by the way he could carry on a seemingly normal life, while at the same time hiding his dark secret.
I think the temptation is to look at some of these guys as something remarkable or something particularly horrific or something particularly unusual, but the reality is, quite often they're from a long line of particularly uninteresting, inadequate people that don't tend to relate particularly well to other people. But obviously the reality is, if they were more bizarre or strange, then they would stand out and would have come to the attention of the authorities a lot earlier.
Well, Peter was very... He used to stay off school and hide as a child in the loft because he didn't like to go to school. I think he used to get picked on. And my dad was more of a sporty, you know, he boxed in the Navy and he played football and cricket, and Peter was just not sporty at all, and I don't think my dad really gelled with Peter because of this. Work-wise, he worked as a grave digger, at Bed Television in Bradford. He worked at the water treatment plant in Gilstead. He had lots of jobs before he finally become a wagon driver, which he seemed to like, and he stuck at that one.
It's quite common for people to imagine that all these offenders are sadistic, or they've got some weird paraphilia or whatever. My particular view on Sutcliffe is that actually there isn't actually a lot of sadism in the behaviours. The real driving force behind this is extreme anger directed at a very specific population. In Sutcliffe's case, of course, in the early days against prostitutes. But actually there isn't a lot of torture in these cases, and in the main they are relatively quick, what we call blitz attacks, extremely violent and extremely sudden blitz attacks, without actually an awful lot of sexual behaviour accompanied in them.
I've read about what Peter got up to, and it's horrendous. I just can't believe that's the same man that I knew growing up, to do those horrendous things to women. How can you do that and then come and have Sunday dinner with your mum and smile and laugh and just act like nothing's happened?
2 weeks after the murder of Jane MacDonald, Sutcliffe struck again. He attacked Maureen Long in Bradford, but she survived the assault when he was disturbed.
He was interrupted in the process of attacking this particular woman, and he fled. And quite clearly he had become rattled. He probably thought he'd been sailing a bit close to the wind, because of course he moved then over the Pennines into Manchester.
When the murders broke in Manchester, we thought, well, he's spreading his territory, his hunting ground, if you like. And there was a fear that where's it going to end? Where's it going to extend these boundaries? And really, you couldn't predict where it was going to be.
On the evening of the 1st of October 1977, Sutcliffe drove to Manchester, where he picked up his next victim, 20-year-old mother of 2, Jean Jordan.
Jean Jordan was a working prostitute, and of course she'd been picked up and had been taken to Southern Cemetery. It would have been an ideal spot to have taken her because it was extremely secluded.
9 days after the murder, Jordan's body was discovered. She had been horrifically mutilated.
She had all the classic stigmata of a Ripper attack. She had the hammer blows to the back of the head. She had deep stab wounds to both the back and the front. And an attempt had been made to saw the head off with a hacksaw.
Detectives were confronted with a mystery. Some of Jean Jordan's injuries and the attempted beheading were made days after she died. Had the Ripper, for some unknown reason, returned to the scene of the crime? In October 1977, Peter Sutcliffe murdered Jean Jordan, a prostitute from Manchester. He dumped her body in the city's southern cemetery. She was the Yorkshire Ripper's 6th victim.
By this time, he was becoming extremely careless, and he made many mistakes in the murder of Jean Jordan. First of all, in taking out with him a brand new, freshly minted £5 note.
Immediately after the killing, Sutcliffe realised that the £5 note he had paid to Jean Jordan could be the clue the police were waiting for. If it was found, it could be traced back to him.
Because Jean Jordan's body hadn't been found immediately, he returned to the body in an effort to retrieve the £5 note. He found the body, but he didn't find Jean Jordan's handbag. And of course, then in an effort, it was believed, to try and persuade the police that this was not a Ripper killing, he tried to cut off Jean Jordan's head.
There was a slashing of the stomach area and a pretty poorly handled effort at decapitating the head, which he describes as, and I think probably is the case, an effort to make something mysterious about this that wouldn't then link that body to the other offences, simply because he couldn't retrieve that £5 note.
Jean Jordan's body was finally discovered on the 10th of October, 9 days after she had died. It was one of the most gruesome crime scenes Greater Manchester Police had investigated. Days later, her handbag was recovered, and in it lay the £5 note.
It was very quickly established that it was a freshly minted £5 note. So Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Ridgway immediately realised, obviously, this is a very solid, positive clue we've got here. If we can find the owner of the £5 note, we can find, in fact, the killer.
Detectives wasted no time in tracing the route of the note, quickly establishing its journey from the Bank of England into Yorkshire, and ending up at one of several firms in the weekly payroll. One of the firms, Clark's of Shipley, was the workplace of Peter Sutcliffe.
So, of course, they then went to the firms and they spoke to the workforce. And, of course, Sutcliffe was interviewed.
Detectives visited Sutcliffe at home and asked about his whereabouts on the night of Jean Jordan's murder. Both he and his wife confirmed they were at home that evening. When asked about his movements on the evening the killer was presumed to have returned to the body, Sutcliffe once again had an answer.
Sutcliffe was able to provide a perfect alibi. He was having a housewarming party and his family alibied him. But there was a slight gap, as was subsequently discovered, between the housewarming party and him arriving back at his own home in Bradford, because he had taken members of his family back to their homes before returning to his home. But of course he hadn't returned to his home immediately. He'd driven back over the Pennines to Manchester to look for the £5 note.
After weeks of detective work, the £5 note inquiry drew a blank. Sutcliffe had slipped the net. Within the next 12 months, 4 more women would lie dead at his hands. Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritker, Vera Millward, and Josephine Whittaker. Around this time, police also realised that 2 other Ripper attacks had been overlooked. 2 attacks that preceded even the murder of Wilma McCann.
Anna Rogulski was the first victim. She was in July 75. Olive Smelt in Halifax a few weeks later. Both of them had received a single heavy hammer blow to the back of the head. Both of them had very unusual superficial wounds to the fronts of their tummies. They'd been caused, in Rogulski's case, possibly by a fingernail, but far more likely the tip of a sharp instrument. And so the circumstances, the single head injury, and these very, very unusual abdominal wounds were what made me highlight a possible connection before McCann and Jackson and the others happened.
In the spring of 1979, a series of letters was sent to George Oldfield, who was in overall command of the Ripper inquiry. The writer signed the letters Jack, claiming he was responsible for the murders.
2 letters went to George Oldfield personally, and the 3rd letter went to the Daily Mirror in Manchester.
In June, detectives received what they thought was the break they were searching for. An audio cassette arrived, and on it, speaking in a clipped northeast accent, was a voice claiming to be the Ripper.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
When the tape arrived, we obviously thought, well, that's another clue. Our killer's from the northeast, and that threw the whole direction of the inquiry.
I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. You can't be much good, can you?
Dubbed Wearside Jack, the man behind the cassette in actual fact had nothing to do with the murders. Both the tape and letters were a complete hoax.
Well, what you often get in police investigations that are of this magnitude is what psychologists call confirmation bias, where a certain piece of information looks quite attractive. And when you have that attractive information and you want to solve the case and you want it to end, your mind tends to fixate on that piece of information and fail to question it, fail to consider alternatives, and fail to look at all the reasons why that information is not helpful to you. So I think that, you know, the Wearside Jack tapes is just another example of that process happening.
The police pressed on, under the assumption the tapes and letters were authentic. They mounted a huge operation to publicise their contents across the north of England.
Since the voice of the man who claims to be the Ripper was broadcast last night, specially set up switchboards in Leeds, Halifax and Sunderland have been flooded with calls.
The publicity involved in the letters and tapes was massive. We were given, I think, what was £1 million worth of free publicity.
We've had a magnificent response, which in fact went on until after 1:30. It was after 1:30 this morning when things began to quieten down. Then they built up again this morning when the handwritings hit the press.
The letters were reproduced on billboards, in newspapers.
Detectives' belief in the letters' authenticity was further reinforced by the fact that saliva on the envelopes matched forensic evidence found on the body of prostitute Joan Harrison, who was murdered in Preston in 1975. Police assumed she was a Ripper victim, linking her death with the sender of the letters. They were wrong. In 2010, her murder was conclusively linked to another man, unrelated to the Ripper murders. Back in 1979, however, detectives were adamant that the letters and the tape were the crucial evidence they had been searching for.
The tape wasn't only broadcast on the national media. A dedicated phone line was established which people could ring to listen to it, you know, whenever the mood took them.
We know now that we are definitely looking for a man who originated in the northeast.
It was a massive, massive enterprise.
Peter Sutcliffe, the architect of the fear that gripped the north of England, was in the clear. Despite photo fits of the suspect made by survivors bearing an uncanny resemblance to him, even his own family were none the wiser.
When the police brought the photo fits out of the Yorkshire Ripper, I thought, God, that looks like my brother. But I was convinced he was a Geordie like everyone else in England, and I had mentioned it to Peter, but I didn't suspect it was Peter because George Allfield drilled it into us all that it was a Geordie.
So much weight was placed on the tape and on the letters, but particularly the tape, that Sutcliffe only had to open his mouth and say, "Ee, by gum," and he's out. Don't be daft, he's got a Yorkshire accent, not a Teesside one.
On one occasion, Carl Sutcliffe even delivered a potential victim into the hands of the Ripper.
The night we went out, me, Peter, Sonia and my girlfriend at the time, we went to the pictures in Bradford. And on the way back, I said to Peter, would it be okay if you run my girlfriend home to Eldwick? And he said, oh, that'll be fine. He said, I'll drop her off. I said, because I don't want that Ripper to get her. He said, oh, and it's your Ripper won't get her when she's with me. I was delivering her into the hands of the Ripper, although she said he saw her walk down a drive into the house before he drove away, and he was a complete gentleman.
The fact the police were so adamant that their suspect was from the northeast of England seemed to instill a confidence within Sutcliffe. Only once did he let his guard slip.
Peter come to visit me one day, and I looked out the window, and there was a Geordie fellow with the same beard as Peter, who lived on his own and I was convinced this was a Ripper, and I said to Peter, there's the Ripper, I'm sure that's the Ripper. And Peter looked out and says, no, that won't be him. And I was convinced the guy was, poor fella. Totally innocent. I was stood with the Ripper, not knowing at the time. And I said, it's about time they caught that Ripper. I'd like to cut his balls off. And to that, Peter got very upset and started crying and left.
On the 29th of July, 1979, the police once again had Sutcliffe on their radar.
The reason for the visit was that his vehicle had been sighted numerous times in the red light districts of Manchester, Leeds and Bradford. When we went to see Sutcliffe, there were certain things we didn't like about him. He didn't seem fazed by our visit.
The detectives were unconvinced by Sutcliffe's explanation of the sightings of his car. They would have been more suspicious had they been told Sutcliffe had been spoken to 4 times previously, including as part of the £5 note inquiry. Sadly, the system let them down, and they carried on with the interview under the misguided assumption that this was the first time Peter Sutcliffe had been spoken to by police.
If only the paper filing system had been more compatible between various bits of incident rooms and so on. If only Sutcliffe had been flagged up already to those 2 detectives as a First Division suspect, as he was already in the system, 20-odd sightings of his car in red light areas, interviewed and dodgy answers on a couple of previous occasions, person of interest in a big way.
So we decided to get as much information as we could, put a report together and take it directly to a senior officer. And I took it personally to Mr. Holland. I remember to this day saying to Mr. Holland about my suspicions with this man, and also I specifically mentioned the photo fit, the one that Marilyn Moore produced, the victim that survived in bustling Thorpe Lane at Leeds. And his words were, if anybody mentions photo fits to me, they'll be doing traffic for the rest of the service. So I left with my tail between my legs, simple as that. And I can't repeat what I thought about the man, but the tapes and letters diverted us from the truth.
In total, Peter Sutcliffe would be interviewed 9 times prior to his arrest. The system, designed to cross-reference pieces of evidence, did exactly the opposite. the clues pointing to the killer were being obscured.
I did a check on Sutcliffe's background, his criminal background. The Criminal Records Office sent me a note saying that he'd been found in a garden with an article going equipped for theft in order to steal. Now, it didn't say that the article was a hammer. Obviously, if it had said a hammer, you know, it would have been straight in there and there'd have been no interview, but would have arrested him without any interview and taken him straight down.
By the end of 1980, another 3 women would be dead. Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill. It would be a stroke of luck on the 2nd of January 1981 that would lead to the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror being stopped. The north of England in the 1980s was in the grip of a serial killer called Peter Sutcliffe. Dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper, he had killed 13 women and left several more with horrific head injuries. Police seemed no nearer to catching him than they were when his reign of terror started in 1975, and were coming under increasing pressure.
The public considered us incompetent, inept, clowns was a word I heard.
It's the biggest shake-up in the 5-year hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. The new head of the team is Chief Superintendent Jim Hobson, seen here with Chief Constable Mr. Ronald Gregory. It's a prompt response by the force to criticism of their handling of the hunt.
You know, I had to bite my tongue sometimes when people would say, why aren't you getting on with it? You know, you'd go for a drink somewhere to your local and they'd ridicule you.
By now, the lack of progress in the case and the spiralling cost of the investigation was attracting the attention of politicians in London.
There was talk at one time of the Metropolitan Police coming up and taking over the inquiry. And the senior officer of West Yorkshire says to us in a briefing, he says, we don't want the Met up here. They haven't caught their Ripper yet. Why should we have them?
On the evening of the 2nd of January 1981, the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper took a sudden turn.
Sutcliffe had gone over into South Yorkshire. He'd gone to Sheffield, quite clearly with the intention of picking up a prostitute. And I'm sure if the circumstances had been right, we would have had another Ripper killing.
Peter Sutcliffe had picked up a Sheffield prostitute named Olivia Reevers. The pair were talking in his car when they were noticed by 2 police officers on a routine patrol.
They might have driven on, but they didn't. For some reason, they decided they would check the registration of the car.
Checks by the police officers quickly revealed that the car had false number plates, and Sutcliffe was immediately arrested on suspicion of theft.
The following day, the police officers decided, on a whim almost, to go back to where the car had been parked and to have a look around. And of course, that was an extremely fateful decision because, of course, they found a hammer and a screwdriver and other implements.
Sutcliffe was immediately interviewed about his movements and his use of prostitutes. His conflicting answers aroused the suspicions of the police. 2 days after his arrest, he came clean. Peter Sutcliffe admitted to being the Yorkshire Ripper, and in a 15-hour statement gave the police a full confession. It wasn't long before the Yorkshire Ripper's true identity began to leak out.
I went straight home and rang my sister, and all my family had congregated at my sister's house. And I went there, battled through about 20 photographers and pressmen outside to get into the house. And indeed, it turned out that it was Peter. He'd admitted to being the Yorkshire Ripper.
And the first thing I did was rush back to the police station, into my locker and dig out my old notebooks and go through them. Found the reference of the interview, and it said, interviewed Peter William Sutcliffe, not satisfied with this man, full report submitted. I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else, but I was thinking, you know, all those women had died, and there were 3 other women had died after I'd submitted that report. Now that's something I've got to carry to my grave, which really there's not a day goes by where there isn't some mention of Sutcliffe or some horrendous murder which gets my memory going again.
Given the fact that Sutcliffe had evaded police for over 5 years, it wasn't surprising that detectives were keen to announce his capture to the world.
A press conference took place at 9 o'clock in the evening.
I can tell you that we are absolutely delighted with developments at this stage.
And it was totally undisguised euphoria.
Can you tell us whether he has a Geordie accent?
I cannot tell you that because I've not heard him speak.
Peter Sutcliffe was charged with 13 counts of murder. Whilst awaiting trial, he was visited by his family, desperate to know the truth behind his actions.
I went to visit him in prison because I just had to know for myself whether he was really the Yorkshire Ripper. And I said, "Have you really done this, Peter? Is this you?" He says, "I'm afraid so." I said, "Well, why did you do it, Peter?" And he said, "Oh, just cleaning up, our kid, just cleaning up."
The trial of Peter Sutcliffe began on the 29th of April, 1981. He admitted 7 counts of attempted murder, but denied 13 separate charges of murder. The prosecution initially stated they would accept a guilty plea of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In simple terms, Sutcliffe claimed he was mad. However, the judge dismissed the plea and ordered that the Yorkshire Ripper stand trial for the murders.
Throughout the trial, really, from day one to the very final day, and even at the sentencing, he showed absolutely no emotion whatsoever. He came up from the cells in the morning, took his seat in the dock, just as though he was arriving in the office for work.
On the 22nd of May, 1981, 34-year-old Peter Sutcliffe was found guilty of the 13 cases of murder. He was sentenced to 20 life sentences, with a recommendation he serve at least 30 years.
My opinion of Sutcliffe was he was a coward. He attacked vulnerable, defenceless women, innocent women, and the attacks were such that they're so violent and so horrific that I feel nothing but contempt for the man. He's not a proper man, not even half a man.
Following Sutcliffe's prosecution, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, Lawrence Byford, was charged with investigating the conduct of West Yorkshire Police during the Ripper inquiry. His report was a devastating indictment.
I think since the Sutcliffe case, there's been all manner of changes, and certain changes are technological, other changes are procedural, other changes are in terms of leadership and the way we think about decision-making.
It changed the face of British policing. It resulted in the setting up of Holmes, the first major inquiry computer programme.
Changed incident room procedures, changed inquiry procedures. Senior officers were trained up that bit more.
It standardised record-keeping and murder inquiry. So the lessons were learned, but they were learnt the hard way. And things that the police had been asking for years, they finally got, but at an awful price.
In 1984, Peter Sutcliffe was transferred to Broadmoor Secure Hospital after being diagnosed as mentally ill. He is unlikely ever to be released. The person responsible for the Wearside Jack letters and tape was unmasked in 2006 as 49-year-old John Humble from Sunderland. He was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 8 years in prison. His trial was a stark reminder that the Yorkshire Ripper is never far from the front pages.
It's always there. It's always foremost in my mind. And when I see the victims, I can't help but feel for them, feel a lot of pathos for them, the survivors. And I feel really bad for them and the relatives, the bereaved. That's who I feel for, that I have compassion for.
It brings back memories where I don't have Mum to see every time I want to see her. All I do is just look up at Mum on a picture. I wish she was here. Always have done.